The Strategy of Information with Nick Inglis, on infogov.net. On today's The Strategy of Information, Nick Inglis talks with industry veteran, Bob Larrivee. Larrivee recently announced his retirement, and their conversation is a retrospective of an illustrious and respectable career in the information space. In that conversation with Bob, you'll hear about his groundbreaking work through the 1980s at industry pioneer company Wang, through to his time leading the profession's education and research at AIM International. Today's discussion covers several decades on the cutting edge of the information profession with Bob Larrivee, an intriguing episode today focused on the information profession over the decades. On today's The Strategy of Information with Nick Inglis, on infogov.net.
When we take for granted where we are today, we lose a richness of understanding. This information profession that we work within didn't just appear, it was built. The transition from paper, boxes, and cabinets to bits, systems, and cloud, it was gradual, and it helps our perspective when we understand what came before us. We forget that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. In order to take paper and put it into systems, we needed to invent imaging. Then to understand those images, we needed text recognition. And when we needed easier access to information, we created mainframes, and then the internet, and servers, and then eventually we found our way to the cloud. There is a history there, and it informs our decisions around information today. We have folder-based systems because of skeuomorphism, the creating of digital objects that take design cues from their physical counterparts that we no longer use. The most obvious being our traditional organization structure of folders, which are digital interpretations of traditional file rooms, which we usually kept in the basements. We are still connected to our history. And in order to not be chained to our history, we must understand our history. We build upon that history, and in order to move forward, we also have to understand how that history also can prevent future growth. As we move away from foldering and towards faceted browsing, a process that's taken over a decade, we have to recognize that skeuomorphism is difficult for people to move away from. There is comfort in the familiar, and there is fear of change. So we, even as information professionals, should become students of history, but of our profession's history. That's something I believe in, and that's why when I saw that Bob Larrivee had announced his retirement and that he was going to focus on his board service and mentoring, I thought it would be important to share some of the stories that I've heard bits and pieces of from Bob over the years. Yes, today we are going back to the future, and we're going to spend some significant time talking about the advancements primarily of the 1980s. You'll hear about some of the work and the companies that laid the path that we all walk upon today with our very special guest, Bob Larrivee. So Bob, welcome to the show. I'm so excited that you've agreed to join me here and have this conversation. You recently announced your retirement on LinkedIn, so many wonderful professionals who have learned from you over the years, who have followed your guidance and been brought to success. They thanked you for your service over the years, and I echo that sentiment fully. You have had an incredible career. So seeing this retirement notice go up, and we'll talk about in a second what retirement actually means for you. I was fortunate enough to have some overlapping time in serving at AIM at the same time as you. I got to see your work up close and personally, and your commitment to this profession. We see the professional that you are today. And, you're incredibly well known in this profession. We see who you are today, but I want to take our audience sort of back in time with you across your profession. So the first question I have for you, Bob, is how did you end up in this information profession?
By mistake. No. But believe it or not, in the late 60s, maybe it was the early 70s, I can't remember exactly when, my dad used to work for Control Data Corporation,
Okay.
CDC, which is not the CDC we know today. But, and my first exposure to digitizing anything came from there. There was a guy there who was in research and development and had built this camera, and that's the way he described it, was a camera, to take pictures of pictures or documents or whatever and digitize it into a computer. Now keep in mind, back then, when they reproduced it, it was a large green screen. You know, it was probably 12 to 16 inches in diameter, and it drew lines, and you would watch the thing surface on the screen. And he was doing imaging.
Yeah.
I didn't know it back then. I didn't, and I didn't realize the impact on it. If they wanted to produce this thing, it was done on a band printer. And they could only reproduce something in a 3 foot by 5 foot poster size.
So
And it was basically numbers overstriking each other to get the tone, to get the coloring, and the shading.
So
It was
it's like
awesome.
those ASCII or ASCII images where it's just you're using the keyboard letters to create an image.
Yep, and overstriking to get darkness and, kind of lighter shades. And so I didn't know what this is. I thought it was fascinating. It was incredible. And then in 1984, I went to work for Wang. And this was the cusp of, we're entering the imaging age. This is when cameras were actually, I don't want to call them book-style cameras. They weren't. But it was basically a T-shaped thing. They had a Nikon 35 millimeter lens that you had to adjust in focus, and you could only take one page at a time. And it was 3 halogen lamps to light this thing up. And it was, it's like, okay, well, this is a little cumbersome, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the whole thing just evolved from that to what we now know today. So, in '84, I got involved in imaging. Little did I know back in the '60s I had already seen this.
Yeah.
So, but I started out in R&D and worked my way in R&D to a point in time where I was looking at marketing folks and saying, wow, what a life they live. They travel the world. All they do is talk and eat, and promote this stuff. And so I'd like to do that. And I wound up jumping to the dark side, as my friends in R&D called it. Spent some time there. And then, of course, over the years, I wound up moving into different roles in the industry as analyst consultant with software companies and so on. And, of course, you and I worked together at AIM for a while.
So
it's been an interesting ride.
Yeah. To say the least. I mean, I was looking through your past work and just thinking, my goodness, you were literally at the forefront of some of these major developments that we all take for granted today. But Wang was, cutting edge of enterprise computers and enterprise technology. I grew up in Massachusetts, and Wang was based in Massachusetts, so I remember hearing, the Wang name. As I was growing up and hearing these, incredible technological breakthroughs that were happening. So, for those who don't know, Wang and IBM were like the rivals with one another, making advancements for imaging, for enterprise information. It was a different language, I assume, back then. Were they calling it imaging in '84?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They weren't calling it document imaging. It was just imaging.
Interesting.
And there were actually three major factions there. There was, like you say, Wang and IBM, and FileNet.
Okay.
And And of course, FileNet got absorbed by IBM several years ago. So now it's like, okay, and IBM's the only one left of the original three.
Yeah.
But back then, everything was proprietary too. You didn't have PCs that's kind of standardized the desktop.
Yeah.
And so when you bought a system, it was either all FileNet, all IBM, all Wang, whatever the case might be, and there was no deviation in that.
And vendor lock-in was a thing. So if you
Oh,
made
yeah.
a bad choice or you chose something that didn't actually meet your needs, you're sort of stuck with it and trying to make it.
Yeah, and that was and if you wanted to go to the competitor, so if all of a sudden somebody wanted to say drop Wang and go to FileNet, that was not an easy task. I mean that was huge to do that, to change your mind. In the late '80s, I was with a team called Freestyle.
Okay.
And Freestyle was actually the forerunner. We're signing everything today, right?
Yeah.
You sign your name. Electronic signature is just something we do, and using a stylus, to access information. Well, back then, we had Freestyle, and Freestyle was the first annotation system of its type, where it worked on a 286 PC.
Okay.
And what we did is we put the operating to sleep, took it over, and using a tablet, or keyboard, or voice, you could annotate documents. So you would touch the tablet, it would take a screenshot of whatever you were looking at, and now you could mark it up and email it to somebody for review. If we were working on budget, for example, I could take a picture of the budget and say, "Hey Nick, can you elaborate a little bit more on what this line item is? I need to be able to better explain this to the boss once we go there."
And that was in
And
'88.
it actually won Product of the Decade by PC Magazine. But the problem was getting back to proprietary. And so it relied on the proprietary Wang imaging system. And now you're talking about, here's Microsoft with the 286 PC, the DOS operating system. And so it just, it didn't kind of make it. But the technology developed. We see that everywhere.
Oh, yeah. I mean, still, voice annotation, there are a lot of vendors that are struggling with that today, and you were doing that back in, the late 80s.
Oh, yeah. And it would play back in real time. So the way that I annotated it and the way that I did it, when you did the playback, it was real time. There was no delay. It was just exactly the way it was recorded.
Yeah.
It was fascinating. Absolutely. And still today, there's really nobody that can do what they did.
I was going to say, that was way ahead of its time. That was...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was one of those technologies where everybody went, "This is incredible," but never saw the business application to it because people didn't work from home. You were in an office. It's like, well, why do I need this? Nick sits right next to me.
I can just talk to him.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that was fascinating with it, it was designed as the director, Steve Levine, said. The stylus was designed after a number 2 pencil.
Yeah.
And so it was multifunction, which meant that I could write with the pointed end, but when I turned it over, I could erase, just like you would with a pencil.
Yeah.
And on screen, it would look like that. To a point, it was so realistic that when we demoed it to people, and they went to erase something, they would actually do this on the tablet, thinking that they had to get rid of the remnants of the eraser.
That's brilliant.
Oh, it was awesome, yeah.
So the timing of this was really just terrible for your team. So I was digging into some of the history of Wang in anticipation of this conversation, knowing you spent, what was it, a decade of your career at Wang?
Yes. 10 years, yeah.
So you were coming out with Freestyle in the late 80s at the same time that, cutting edge technology, but at the same time, Wang was starting to lose the war with IBM and FileNet. In my mind now, obviously, I'm just thinking IBM because FileNet is now with IBM.
Right.
How much, you were creating this cutting edge technology in the late 80s. By 92, Wang was entering bankruptcy. That must have been just heartbreaking to know you created something that was just way ahead of its time, groundbreaking, and then the company itself started to falter.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the whole bankruptcy thing, because it was the quickest turnaround in history, in the industry at its time. And one of the reasons was, and this is something that I had learned later on in years, apparently Wang had developed OLE.
OLE.
So object link embedding.
Ah, okay.
Which is what Microsoft was writing on. And so we filed bankruptcy, but they found out that Wang owned the patent on that.
Started getting the license.
And then Microsoft and Wang made a deal. Yeah, they kind of made a deal, and we got some cash influx, which helped with the bankruptcy to come out of it, out of Chapter 11. And Microsoft wound up with a deal to use the technology.
Yeah.
And at first, when Windows embedded imaging, it was the Wang imaging product that was embedded in Microsoft Windows.
Wild. And
so it's really kind of wild, a wild ride there. Not one that I would ever care to do again.
Yeah. You wouldn't take that decade and do it over again.
No, not the way it was anyway.
So
I had a lot of fun.
So the imaging side, I'm trying to understand where the technology actually ended up, and the Wang technology ended up in some really wild places. So like you can find some of that IP in Windows, like you know, there's still the legacy of that. You've got the imaging technology, which at one point ended up with Kodak.
Yep.
And then the rest of it, got bought by Getronics?
Getronics, yeah.
And,
well, some of it, because Cable and Wireless actually was there too.
Okay.
We were all part of that. Let's see, where else were there things? There were several patents that were held in relation to what we now refer to as smart cards.
Okay.
And so if you kind of go way back into the original patents, there's some of that. There's voice recognition, text-to-speech. We were in the cutting edge with that as well. In fact, we actually, I was with a group for a little while called the Advanced Technology Group, and we were a think tank. It was the What If. We used to call ourselves the What If guys. And we would be asked, is it possible, either with our own technology or with something that we buy, to do X?
Yeah. And
we actually developed an Office of the Future in the late 80s that used voice recognition, text-to-speech. We used, it was a wireless telephone to control the whole thing. We had gas plasma screens mounted into what we refer to as ether space, which was actually made by Herman Miller. And so we built an entire computer into the wall of the Herman Miller. It was
so cool.
Just one of these things that it just kept, kind of evolving and going on to a point where I think it was either 88 or 89 when we were invited to participate in a documentary on artificial intelligence with Ray Kurzweil. And this was something he was doing with the Museums of Science.
Yeah. And
we were actually using a Kurzweil voice recognition system to control the environment, the zero footprint environment. So yeah, we were out there.
Yeah, I mean,
we were out there. Yeah.
It sounds like there are stories. We hear the stories out of like HP Labs and Hewlett Packard and the West Coast, development and advancement, because a lot of that ended up in the iconic companies of Microsoft and Apple and Intel, and there's a lot of documentation around the history of Silicon Valley. There's not a whole lot around what happened with Wang, and it was essentially the East Coast think tank, and some of the things that you're describing here. It'd be nice if someone went back to. I mean, you were on the cutting edge of all of these things that If these technologies weren't developed, this pandemic experience that we're all going through in the 2020s, I mean, if you hadn't made those advancements, we wouldn't have been able to do this in the same way.
No.
Which is just wild to think about.
And the lab that I was with, the Advanced Technologies Lab, our job was to try and take the technologies and position it for business use.
Yeah.
So, when we had this new thing that we developed, or we found something in the market space that looked like it made sense to integrate with, we would take it to that lab and say, okay, where could we use this? How could we use this in business?
Brilliant.
In, I think it was 88. We used to have annual user conferences. And they would, it's almost like in the movie Independence Day, where they go down into the bunker and he says, yeah, they don't let me out much. That was kind of like us. But once a year, they would dust us off and trot us out in front of the users group, and we would bring the whole office of the future with us. And it was kind of fascinating to get the reactions. And there was one year, I think it was 88, we had the Wang laptop, and there was a communication software called Carbon Copy Plus.
Okay.
And of course, this is modem to modem now. You're talking like 300 baud, painfully slow by today's standards. But we were able to connect the laptop to a PC, and we actually demonstrated this live from Copley Square. I dialed into the Wang Towers, into the PC in my office, took control of it.
Brilliant. So
here we are standing there in Copley, in Boston. And I said, here's my PC. And I pulled up things like AutoCAD and all this other stuff to show that it was working. Then what I did is I connected to the VS mini computer that we had in the lab and showed an application there, and then connected from that to a mainframe.
Wow.
And all of this, in real time from Boston. Like I said, it was painfully slow, but it worked.
Yeah.
And everybody was like, wow, this is incredible, but why would I want to do this?
They didn't know yet.
No, they didn't. And so I said, well, like if you were working from home, oh no, I don't bring work home.
Get ready.
I leave that at the office. And I said, well, if you're on the road, like here in Boston, you could actually get to your office and, oh no, that's sacred time.
Yeah.
I don't want to be working while I'm here.
This is my networking time. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, but I mean, this was back in the late 80s that we were doing this, and we called it the remote office connection, which is the combination of all these things that were bundled together.
See, there was a presentation I did last, I don't know, it was 9 months ago, early on in the pandemic, and I said, thank goodness this pandemic didn't hit 10 years earlier, because we wouldn't have had the technology. Well, little did we know Wang had the technology all along, and it just got split between companies, and that vision got realized later.
One of my favorites was with the email system that they had, Wang Mail. If by some chance you sent out an email and then all of a sudden you went, I shouldn't have done that, it actually had a recall feature.
The one thing that everybody has wanted.
Yeah, I think you had like 60 seconds or something like that to recall the whole thing before it wound up in the other person's inbox.
That's funny, because now I use a plugin to do that for myself in my email system. So it doesn't send it; it just keeps it in queue for a moment before it sends it out. So if I think of something else, I can quickly add it. You guys were doing it in the 80s. Yep. So
it's one of those things where I look at today and I say, well, we've gone like a total, 360, right? We're right back to where we were in the 80s.
You've come right back to that same set of technologies that you were pushing the boundaries on that we are now completely reliant on today.
Yeah. I'm just glad the music's different.
I'm going to talk about music here as well, so don't think I'm going to let you skate without mentioning your bass guitar skills.
Oh.
So after Wang, you you spent some time as an industry analyst. You spent some time as a consultant. You did some consulting. Um, and eventually you found your way over to AIM. Is there
Yep.
is there a highlight in that between Wang pre-AIM period? Because I don't think we've ever really talked about that. We've talked about Wang in your time there before, but that time between Wang and AIM, I don't know a lot about, and I'd love to hear more about that time from you.
It was kind of a period of bouncing. I did go to work in Norwell. There was a group there called BIS Strategic Decisions. That's where I went right after Wang.
Yeah.
And the guy that I worked for was Bruce Silver. Bruce was actually the chief developer for the imaging systems at Wang when I was in R&D there. And so I went to work for Bruce. And then he left, and Connie Moore came in. I don't know if you know.
I know Connie, yeah.
And so she came in, and she started working in place of Bruce. And while I was there, working as an analyst, an industry analyst, I had a vice president of product marketing from Tech Data reach out to me.
Okay.
And they were looking for somebody to come to Tech Data here in Clearwater, Florida, and start up or take over and rebuild their imaging program. They knew that imaging was up and coming.
Yeah.
And this is around 1994, I guess it was. They knew they wanted to be in the game. They weren't quite sure what it was.
Yeah.
And so they reached out in February, which, as we all know, February in New England can be a little rough. And the day I got the call, I had spent about 2.5 hours commuting into the office.
And then coming back
said,
to shovel.
Yeah. And I asked her, I said, so what's the weather like there in Clearwater, Florida? And she said, well, it's kind of on the cool side today. It's only about 65 degrees. And I kind of went, yeah. And so my wife and I talked about it, and we wound up moving down here, and I was with them for several years. At the time, they didn't realize they were actually selling imaging products.
Yeah.
And so I went through the catalog, reclassified things that would count, like scanners and some of the software that they had. And we started bringing in companies like Kodak, Bell & Howell,
yeah.
FileNet. we were actually selling FileNet in Tech Data and distribution. They had a great run.
Yeah.
And they still are. I mean, they're still one of the leading distributors.
I still know that name. They are still doing well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're still, they took off with it and just went nuts. Yeah. It got to a point for me, though, where it was kind of, I was getting bored, I guess. I have a short attention span sometimes.
Well, Wang didn't, Wang gave you all of the cutting edge, whiz bang, amazing things. I can't imagine leaving that and going to, corporate imaging just purely. That doesn't seem to Yeah, when I started there, I think we were at like 30 million. We grew it to 300 million, and it was like, okay, we made another, 1.5 million today. Yeah.
What's there? So they're doing fantastic with it. I left them, and I think it was Pegasus that I went to work for then. Pegasus Transtech. I've been with so many. ComCom Systems, which did recognition mainly on medical. I was with them for a while. Pegasus Transtech, which is actually the trucking industry. That was a lot of fun.
Okay.
I did that during Y2K.
Checking all the computers ready for the bug.
Yeah, and people had bought things like Kofax, and they wanted to know if it was Y2K ready, or do I have to worry about it exploding? Everybody was worried about that happening, and it didn't, of course. I've worked with Steve Weissman over at the Holly Group. We've teamed up on several occasions. And then DocuBase Systems was the last vendor that I worked for before joining AIM.
And
So, and then AIM, it was, as you know, I started there in education.
Yeah.
And went there because I felt it was time for me to try and give something back.
And you did.
So help build the programs and thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, and
your impact on AIM was a huge one. You led those education programs. You led research. You did a whole lot for the profession.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it was fun at AIM.
Yeah. How did you end up from what was the jump from what was DocuBase? I think was the last.
Mm-hmm.
You were doing marketing with DocuBase, and then ended up over on the AIM side. How did that all come to be?
Well, I've actually been a member of AIM since 86,
Okay.
1986, and always involved at different levels. At the local level, many years ago, their conference was, I'm going to say, guided by a conference committee.
Yeah.
And it was the membership that actually said, this is what the theme should be, and these are tracks, and we used to review the papers and all that, the submissions. And I got to know folks really well in AIM as a result of that. And so when I was at DocuBase, Atla Shecklin, who was the guy who started the education programs there, he and I had known each other for a little while, and he was in the Tampa area. And so I got a call from him saying, look, I'm going to be around, you want to meet for dinner? And it's like, okay. And dinner turned into an interview. It was like...
He had a way of doing it.
It was one of those... yeah, he did. It was one of those things where, we're sitting there having dinner, and he goes, so you know that I'm starting education programs with AIM? And I said, yeah. And he said, how would you like to be part of it? And I went, okay, this is a surprise, but... and the rest is history. We wound up working a deal, and I went to AIM and was there for many years. And my last position there, as you mentioned, was as chief analyst, in the research, doing the industry watch reports and all that. And it got to a point where I had reached that level again where it was like, yeah, I need something different. And so I sat down with Peggy and the folks there and decided to strike out on my own, which was the consultancy.
Yeah.
And now I'm at that point again where it's like, yeah, I need to slow down a little bit, and start enjoying life more.
You bring us to retirement, and for audience members that are listening and not watching, those are some air quotes around retirement, because I can't imagine I can't imagine Bob Larrivee sitting on his hands and just relaxing ever. I could see you maybe taking a few steps back, but I can't imagine you would not keep yourself involved. So
no,
and you are.
Yeah, I am. I'm currently serving on the board of directors at NIRMA, the Nuclear Information and Records Management Association. I've been a member there for probably the last 10 years.
Yeah.
I'm also on the board of advisors, the editorial board for Document Strategy. I write for both organizations, so articles, magazine articles, that type of thing. I'm also on the advisory board of two small software companies that are, one is in the kind of the workflow segment, the other one is in the capture segment. And so I keep myself busy that way, but I also am a musician.
Yes, indeed.
And when in non-COVID times, I'll say, I do get the good fortune to go out and play with some rather marvelous musicians. They push me. They push me a bit and help me become better at that.
You're selling yourself short there as well. I know that in addition to music running, in addition to information being at your core, music is also at your core. And I see that with actually a lot of people in our profession. They're music adjacent people or math adjacent people. And it feels like everybody's got at least one of those two things. So, you know, do you think there's a connection somewhere in our brains between music and information, or is it just, you know, happenstance?
Um, there are some folks that would say, you know, my personal opinion is I think it's the creative side, but it's also the composition. It's the ability to put the pieces together and make it work, and I think that's part of it. You know, it's like I sit in on an open jam session. Well, I did up until last March. Hopefully, I'll get back there again soon. But it's basically musicians that get up and play, and in some cases have never played together before.
Oh wow!
But we know the same tunes, you know, the basic tunes, and so here you are, 4 or 5 guys standing there, never played a note together, and everything just kind of gels, and it's because you have this ability to hear what's going on around you and be able to fit those pieces together. And I think that's a big part of it, you know, and in what we do in this industry, it's the ability to look at all of this and say, okay, let's make sense of it and bring it into something that's cohesive. So but I do have a few toys. I don't know if my hand's not as steady as it used to be, but.
And they are beautiful. I have admired your collection from afar for a great many years, and I see some new guitar. I see some new ones back there that I haven't seen since the last time we talked. So after we're off the air, you're gonna have to show me those beautiful instruments on the wall.
There's actually a couple missing.
Where did they go?
They're in hiding, actually. I didn't have enough room on the wall.
Yeah, when you've run out of room for your instruments, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I like the connection between music and information, and the composition piece is an interesting one. If I were a headhunter at this point in my career, I'd point myself towards musicians that are in information adjacent professions, since a lot of the folks that I know that are, you know, have done amazing things like you've done have that in their background. It's an interesting correlation. I don't know that it's causation, but it's certainly correlation.
Yeah, it's that's the only way that I could put it. You know, and like I said, it's one of those things where musically you're putting the pieces together, the same thing that we do in life and information management. So.
Yeah. So looking back, you know, you've taken us on a retrospective of your career. For the audience that maybe newer into the profession, what's the one thing you wish someone had said or you had known before entering this crazy information profession?
That's a good one. I guess it would be how to better explain it. Yeah. Because I think that's the biggest challenge is how to put all of this technology and take what's been done and what we know and how to explain it in terms that the average person can understand, and then make that connection. Here's what it means for me.
Yeah.
Because the vendors are very poor at that. And I will admit that I've been very poor at that in the past myself.
Yeah, we've all struggled with that. Because we've changed the labels as well.
Well, that's part of it too. It's the same thing with a different name.
Yeah.
You know, and I have people that get upset with me when I'll look at their products and say, well, you're not doing anything different than I saw back in the 80s. And they go, what?
Well, that you saw in the 80s, the rest of us had no idea.
Exactly. And so, you know, I'll look at things and say, okay, this is wonderful, but tell me what it does for somebody in finance. Tell me what it does for somebody in human resources. You know, and just because it's great technology doesn't mean that it's going to be beneficial in business if they don't understand what to do with it.
Yeah.
You know, and I've always said, I've been one of these people. My favorite saying is, technology for the sake of technology is useless. It has no place, you know, and until people understand what to do with it. And freestyle's the prime example.
Yeah.
It was the greatest technology of its time, but nobody could sit there and say, this is how I'll use it in business.
Yeah. And everyone seemed
when
to
we
recognize.
did try, yeah, they recognized that you know, this could be useful, but until you could actually sit down with them and go through maybe a process or something like that,
yeah,
and tie it directly to what they were doing.
Yeah, that's the use case. That's how you.
Mm-hmm.
We've struggled with that from time to time in this profession.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Although people have needed it, they've come to us with the use cases.
Mm-hmm. And even at that, you know, when you present them with some options, sometimes the connection just isn't there.
So you've got the long view on this profession in a way that I certainly don't, and a lot of other folks don't. What if you're looking at, you know, the trajectory of the profession over the years? Is there a logical next step? Is there a logical thing that comes next? Or, you know, you mentioned a cycle. I think it was before we started recording. There's a cycle we go through.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something that seems like the obvious next thing in that cycle, or in your long view of the profession? What should happen now?
Well, I one of the things that I see in my retirement, it's kind of like Grump said over the weekend. I retired my retirement, and I'm glad he did. But one of the things that I'm doing is I'm looking out and seeing what's coming down the line. And you've got things like digitally enabled contact lenses, right? And this is a reality.
Yeah.
And, you know, Samsung's got them, and they're supposed to be commercially available within the next couple of years, where what I look at becomes a live stream video, or I can take snapshots.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at these things and thinking to myself, okay, so this is wonderful technology, but what does it mean from a business perspective? How could I use this? Number two is, what does it mean from a security perspective? Let's think about that.
Yeah.
You know, I walk in with a set of digital contact lenses, and I can take pictures of anything I want. And so these are some of the things that I'm looking at. You know, what's going to, and as an information professional today, you've got to take these things seriously now, because it's going to be here. I mean, it's like smartphones. You know, I can take this and do pretty much anything I could do with a mainframe years ago.
Yeah.
You know, there's more power in my phone than there used to be in my office. So,
bizarre.
Yeah. And so I look at those types of things. The ability to be able to read somebody's brainwaves and translate that into an image or into some type of movement. You know, I'm watching in the medical industry, and how they're actually being able to record what somebody's thinking to manipulate mechanical arms. I mean, this is awesome. It's absolutely incredible, and it's here. I mean, it's not coming, it's here. It's just a matter of when does it get commercialized, and then how does an information management professional deal with these things, as far as the data they collect, as far as the security and access controls that they're going to need to put in place. And so that's what I see. You know, that's where I'm at right now.
And the implications on knowledge management of your employees having cameras on, lenses. It's going to present some very interesting challenges for the next generation of information professionals.
Oh, absolutely. You know, privacy. Think about privacy laws.
What privacy?
What does that mean?
Yeah.
What does privacy law mean? You know, how do you deactivate somebody's contact lenses before they enter a building?
and security
I
on
don't
that.
know the answer to that. Yeah.
What happens when someone hacks your contact lenses?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yikes.
And I look at like Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity.
Yeah.
And you look at what he's thinking about, where there will be no more need for hardware and software and those things as we know it today. It'll basically be a chip embedded in your brain, or not, some other type of device that allows you to communicate through thought.
Yeah.
Right? And basically you're tying into the internet, if it's still going to be called that.
Yeah.
And you and I can have this conversation just by thought. And what you know, I know, and what I know, you know, and knowledge management goes to a whole new level.
Yeah, it's a whole different profession once we hit that point.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's the Borg and the assimilation into the collective, right?
So, Bob, put yourself in my shoes for a second, in the shoes of our audience. Is there something I haven't asked you that you wish I had, or something that you want to convey out to our audience of professionals in this space? What's the question or the last words you want to leave folks with?
My favorite question is why, and it's the most annoying question in history. But when you're looking at something, as an information professional, always question why. Why are we doing this? I've heard this over and over again in instances where somebody might be bringing in SharePoint or some other product, and they'll say, well, we're moving in this direction. This is going to be our platform. And my question is always why. And they'll say, well, because it's the technology. Okay, but what are you going to do with it? Why do you want this? Why do you need is actually the better question. Why do you need this in your business? What is the purpose? And a lot of times people will say, well, nobody ever got fired for buying Microsoft. It's like IBM in the old days. Nobody ever got fired for choosing IBM because it was IBM. Well, but that doesn't mean it's right.
Exactly.
And so always ask that question, why? Why are we doing this? Why are we moving in this direction? Why do we need to do this? Why?
I love it, Bob. That is a great point for us to end on. It has been an absolute pleasure, my friends. Bob Larrivee, veteran of the profession, all-around great guy. Thank you for taking the time to have the conversation today. Enjoy your retirement. Retirement, in air quotes again for the audience that's listening. I personally want to thank you for your service to the profession through your career and through AIM. Obviously, you have had a passion for sharing your knowledge and sharing best practices in a way that most people in this profession don't. So thank you for giving back, and man, I have been reliant on that guidance and expertise, and the knowledge that you transferred into my head when we were working together. I've relied on that, and I keep asking why. And I hope our audience members will keep asking why as well. But thank you for your service to the profession. It has meant the world to a great many of us. And I wish you, Bob, the absolute best in retirement and whatever this next chapter presents.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks for having me on. It's always been a pleasure to talk with you, and I look forward to it sometime in the near future.
Absolutely. We'll be circling back with you, Bob, for sure. Thank you again.
Thanks, Nick.
It's great to hear these stories of Bob's work at Wang and beyond. It grounds us in perspective, knowing that our profession didn't simply arrive, it was built. And it was built by great folks like Bob Larrivee, and I'm so incredibly thankful for his willingness to be on the show. That's our episode, but before you head out, be sure to subscribe to the Strategy of Information. And if you love conversations like this, help us make more possible by supporting the program. Head to infogov.net to learn more. Our next episode, it's going to take us from history to the cutting edge. we're talking with serial entrepreneur and blockchain expert Michael Hiles, who is going to be talking to us about blockchain in the information profession and his newest venture, 10XTS. I think he may just be on the verge of changing our information profession forever. So get ready for a brain workout as we talk blockchain with Michael Hiles on the next episode. I am excited for you to tune into the next episode of The Strategy of Information. Until then, I wish you the absolute best in all of your information endeavors.
The Strategy of Information is listener and sponsor supported programming. Subscribing to the podcast is free, but supporters gain access to every episode in HD video, bonus episodes, the occasional extended interview, merch like tote bags and stickers, and so much more. Head to infogov.net to learn more about supporting the program. Corporate sponsorship options are now available for Season 2 of The Strategy of Information. The Strategy of Information with Nick Inglis is available on podcast platforms everywhere and online at infogov.net. This has been a production of infogov.net.